Hi everyone, it's time for a little more chemistry. Hey, in this video, let's talk about kinetics, which has to do with the rate or speed of reactions. And we'll also talk about energy diagrams, these ways of kind of analyzing reactions in terms of energy and kinetics or speed. So here we go, nice little graphic to get us going. Pick up some speed here. So reactions go at different rates, and there's reasons for that. We'll look at some of those right now. So some of these you probably already familiar with. If you can't get something to go, you heat it up, or maybe you added a catalyst, and that's exactly right. The other way to speed up reaction is just add more reagents, right? So, if you can't get your popcorn to pop, you heat it up till a reaction takes place. Um, Campfire, if it's burning too slowly and not putting enough heat, throw more wood on the fire, add more reactants, same deal. And a catalyst. Okay, well, it's kind of struggling to see what you might have thought about catalysts, um, common experiences, but it's a substance that doesn't get used up and it speeds up the reaction. The most common ones are enzymes, which are nature's catalysts, specialized proteins that speed up chemical reactions. So what's going on here? These are great reasons why, or great ways to speed up a reaction, but what's really happening at the molecular level? Why does raising the temperature, adding more reactants, or adding a catalyst speed up chemical reactions? Well, this is what we got. Our understanding of a chemical reaction is that we have some reactants. They contain bonds and atoms. They do a reaction and form new molecules. Or essentially, the bonds have to break, atoms shuffle from one molecule to the other, and then reattach. That's a chemical reaction. You take some old molecules, you break them apart, reattach them to make new molecules. Well, it turns out breaking bonds requires energy. And so right there, if we understand a chemical reaction, let's underline a few things here. Where's my pen? Chemical reaction is actually just caused by collisions. If you could view molecules in a beaker undergoing a reaction, one molecule is just going to collide with the other one. And the act of collision has energy that can break chemical bonds. And that's what it takes. You can't have a glancing blow, molecules just kind of skimming past each other a little bit gently. That's not enough to break a bond. It's almost like a head-on collision or a very fast reaction. Very fast moving molecules can collide with enough force to start breaking chemical bonds. And that's the whole idea. That's the collision theory of chemical reactions. It's the collision energy that causes the bonds to break. Molecules start falling apart. They're very unstable. They'll quickly reattach new atoms, shuffle the atoms, and hopefully form new molecules. Okay, so if that's the basis of a chemical reaction, that is a collision between molecules, then we kind of make sense of why speed up a reaction first can be done by heating up molecules. Raising the temperature simply makes molecules move faster. So we'll see later in this course that the um, the average kinetic energy of molecules is proportional to temperature, meaning that raise the temperatures, the molecules move faster. Okay, and if molecules are moving faster at higher temperatures, then every time they collide, they're more likely to collide with a lot of force, the force required to break a chemical bond and start a reaction. Also, if the molecules are moving faster, they're more likely to collide more often or more frequently. Okay, and if they have more collisions, more chances to break the chemical bonds and get things going. If you add more reagents, add more molecules, well, then simply having more molecules means you're more likely to have a collision. That's pretty straightforward. In chemistry, we are going to measure amounts of reactants in terms of concentration. Now that one's a term you're probably familiar with. I always relate it to someone wanting espresso, really it's concentrated, little cup, but it's packed with a lot of flavor, a lot of caffeine. And then grandma, she wants her weak, not concentrated, her very dilute tea. She gets hot water and dips the tea bag in it maybe 3 times and then throws away the bag. very weak cup of tea, not concentrated with all the molecules, the flavor molecules found in tea. That's the idea. The chemist wants to know how many molecules per unit volume. And so we're going to measure that. I'll give you the equation for that in a second. But we also talked about a catalyst speeding up a reaction. Okay, so without getting into too much detail, the chemical reaction, like I said, is going to break some bonds. And sometimes you're left with an incomplete molecule. And that incomplete molecule is called an intermediate. Sometimes they're called short-lived products. So you'd have a collision between some reactants, shatter the molecules apart a little bit, and these little pieces of molecules are intermediates. You can't like bottle them up and store them in a bottle. They're too unstable, but they'll quickly react again to form products. One mechanism as to how a catalyst works is that the catalyst itself can react with the reagent to turn it into a reactive intermediate. So there's lots of different things that can happen. But all catalysts in some way change the manner, the procedure of changing reactants to products. And it does so in such a way that it's easier to do. And if it's easier to do, it requires less collision energy, then the catalyst will naturally speed up the reaction. And what's kind of cool about a catalyst is that it just keeps recycling. You can just keep reusing the same amount. It doesn't get used up. It's not a reactant that changes in the product and then it's something new. No, a catalyst speeds up the reaction somehow, and then it doesn't get used up. If you take more chemistry, we can go into more detail about catalysts. But right now, I just want you to know, catalysts speed up a reaction, and they themselves don't get used up. Cool. All righty. Speeding up reactions. Concentration. So in our next video, I believe, we're going to discuss concentration in a little more detail. So I thought I'd introduce it now. Since point number 2 is adding more reactants, but we want to measure how many reactants per unit volume, and we're going to use the metric system. We'll measure volume in liters, and we're going to count molecules in moles. Big surprise there. And so the units for concentration are moles per liter, and it's typically abbreviated MOL divided by L, moles per liter. And that's such a common thing to do, is measure how many molecules per liter. Chemists gonna get lazy, and there's like 5 little things right here, an M, an O, an L, a slash, another L. We get lazy and we just write the capital M, and it's called molar concentration. I can't spell. And sometimes it's called molarity. But I tell students, if you ever have to change units or convert units and you're given the capital M, first thing you should do is just change it back into moles per liter. More on that later. Oh, and here I kind of mentioned earlier, enzymes are nature's catalysts. And so chemists are envious of them. They're incredibly efficient, very selective, meaning that out of, like, they're found in cells, and a cell has many, many molecules in it, but an enzyme can find the one and only one molecule and do a chemical reaction to it, and it leaves all the other ones alone. They're just powerful, powerful molecules. It's very specialized catalysts. And so chemists are envious. We like to design our own that could be just as effective, and we're a long ways off, but a lot of progress has been made trying to make catalysts, things that speed up reaction, but you can keep reusing them. They don't get used up. All right, so that's the kinetics portion, the rate of reactions portion. Let's talk about energy diagrams. Energy diagrams are pictures. We're kind of mapping out the energy of reaction. And from that, we can kind of get a better feeling about how energy changes during a reaction, especially with relation to thermodynamics. You know, delta G, free energy, the enthalpy. Let's put a few labels here. So we got delta G, which is free energy. We got delta H, which is enthalpy. Got an H in there, enthalpy. also known as heat of reaction. And then we have S, entropy. That's a measure of disorder or randomness, or kind of spreading the energy around. Nature likes to spread it around a little more randomly. Okay, so those are all different types of energy. We'll probably just stick to delta G and delta H in our energy diagrams. And then I'll tie in kinetics in these pictures. That's kind of interesting. Okay, so what's an energy diagram? It's an X and a Y axis. On the Y-axis, we typically plot energy. Most of the time, it'll be delta G. Like I said, other energy diagrams might only look at the heat of reaction, the delta H. You're going to see both. Delta G here, I'll start with free energy. And then the X-axis. Okay, it's sort of like time, but you don't have units of seconds or minutes. There's some really slow reactions, like watching a nail rust that could take days. There's other reactions like decomposing plastics that could take years or even longer. So we really don't put units on our X-axis, and we don't call it time. I know, that's a little weird. We call it something called reaction progress, or something similar to that, just meaning, hey, the reaction is going to continue. We're going to start over here with reactants, and we're going to end up with some products eventually, and we're not going to really specify how much time it takes. Okay, so we're halfway through our energy diagram. You got energy on the y-axis, reaction progress on the x, and then if you don't have any other data, you just make some estimates in your drawing. So let's say we have a chemical reaction that is spontaneous. And so what that means is that we're going to have some reactants with some energy. And yeah, you can go in the lab and do some calculations. You probably had a couple homework problems before where you calculate delta G using this equation. So you could do that for the reactants. And then I put a little line here saying, okay, starting at 0 energy, we climb up here to some value. And sometimes you have units of energy on here, but most of the time you just get a feel for it. So I put it like this high up, meaning some energy. And then after the reaction is over, we're going to have products with a lower amount of energy if the reaction is spontaneous. So I'll say when spontaneous, reactants will have more energy than products. Or in other words, if the amount of energy of the reactants starts up here, it's going to go down to this level, right? So you can measure the height on the y-axis if you wanted to. And this amount of decrease in energy is the change in energy. Yeah. So that's the basics of the energy diagram, saying this is where you start, that's where you end. Well, how do you get there? What's the path? Well, it comes back to the collision theory of chemical reactions. You need to get these reactions to crash into each other with a lot of energy. And if one's just sitting still and the other one bumps into it and bounces off, that may not be enough energy. You might have to have both of them moving head-on collision or pretty close, a glancing blow. They need some energy. So they have to be in motion. So you heat these up, you get the reaction started. They're not perfectly at this level of energy. You give them a little kick, and they actually have to climb up a hill before they can go over the products. All right, let's go into a little bit of detail here. So the energy of the reactants have some stable value, but then in the collision, they have to gain this much energy, and that's called EACT. And hopefully I didn't cut and paste it too far down here. Nope, there it is. The activation energy, EACT. It's an initial input of energy to get the spontaneous reaction started. So let's talk about a fire. Let's say you stack up some pieces of wood, some logs, so you got some kindling, maybe some paper. It's all neat and dry, ready to go. Remember, to get a spontaneous reaction going, sometimes you have to get a little kick. In this case, you have to light a match, get a little spark going. And so that little spark carries much more energy than the level of these reactants. You hold a match, let's say, to the edge of the paper, and the edge of the paper catches on fire. So the molecules that make up the paper, as it gets hit by the match, are going to increase in energy. And if they can climb up to this value of energy, they'll have enough to get over this hill, the activation energy hill, to move forward and change into products. And then if the wind picks up and blows out the flame, those molecules may not have enough energy, enough thermal energy, heat energy to get over the hill. They won't collide with enough force to break bonds and keep burning. And so we would say, yeah, if the energy is too low or you don't have a good spark to get it going, it can't climb this hill. And that gives us another idea of kinetics. If you have a big hill, that's going to make for a very slow reaction. So if the active energy is very large, not many molecules are going to have enough collision force to get over the hill. Then again, if the energy diagram shows a very small hill, so start reactants, go to products, and then we just have a little hill. It's only a little activation energy. Small activation. Then this should be a very fast reaction. Just at room temperature, these molecules might collide with enough force to get the reaction going. Cool, that's the idea. Okay, so we talked a little bit about spontaneous. I forgot to point out the change in sign here, right? So if you start with this amount of energy and you go down to here, that's a negative amount. It's gone down. Delta G is negative. And remember we said, what was it? Most people don't like spontaneous reactions. They react negatively to them. Spontaneous reaction is not usually it's usually a negative thing for most people. You get scared, you scream, get mad. Okay, that's how I remember it. So that's our diagram there for a spontaneous reaction. Got a couple new terms for us. Exergonic means that the reaction is spontaneous. Endergonic means the reaction is non-spontaneous. Where are these terms coming from? They're coming from modification of exothermic and endothermic. So we'll go back to those new terms in just a second. But for now, let's draw another energy diagram. And this time, let's plot delta H, the heat of reaction. So again, you could say, hey, the reactants have some amount of energy, and I'm just going to choose that they go to products with a lower amount of energy. And then we're just going to make a hill like this. Woo, kind of ended that hill a little funny. Let's try again. That's a little better. So this amount here is the activation energy. It's not a medium-sized hill, so medium rate, kind of fast, not too fast. If the hill is bigger, it'd slow down. If the hill is smaller, it'd speed up. Where the reactants begins in terms of energy and where it ends up, here it's a decrease. And if I'm measuring the delta H, this decrease in energy is negative. And remember my analogy with a fire. You definitely know a fire gives off heat energy. It's releasing, it's exiting. The energy is exiting the fire. So be the fire and you're losing it, turning into ash. So that's how I remember, if you're losing it, your energy is going down if you are the fire. So if delta H is a negative value, then it's exothermic. And you can look at the energy diagram and see that reactants start high, products start end up low. You go down in energy, so it's negative. Then you just look at your y-axis to see, well, are they talking about free energy or enthalpy? Here I was talking about enthalpy, so if it goes down, it's exothermic. It's possible that you have an endothermic reaction. And we'll plot delta H here. And I guess I should have been writing reaction progress down here. Sort of like our scale for time. But let's start the reactants here. And now we'll say we'll end up with products that have higher energy. Kind of a crazy looking curve, but you get the idea. And so now where you start to the top of the hill is your activation energy. And where you start and you end is your change in enthalpy, your delta H. And it went up, it increased. So here delta H is positive. The reaction is absorbing heat energy. It's sucking it into itself, yeah. Whoa, sorry, I was cut and pasting and I didn't change this. Heat energy is absorbed during a reaction. There we go. Okay, so this quantity of energy increase goes in the products. That's why the products are higher in energy. It is possible to have an endothermic reaction, right? So you just need a change in entropy that's really positive, right? A lot of disorder, and it could be spontaneous. Perhaps we talked about coupling reactions, and if not, let me just say that it's possible to have one chemical reaction push on another chemical reaction and force it to go. Yeah, and so it's possible to drive a reaction if it's not spontaneous and just make it go. And so that might be the case here, trying to push this reaction and make it go. Uphill in energy, it's endothermic. Okay, so be familiar with those terms, exothermic, endothermic, and be able to look at energy diagram and at a glance, or a little moment of inspection, realize, okay, this diagram is delta H, so it's endothermic. And this diagram, start high and low, ooh, that's going down, it's a decrease, delta H, oh, it's exothermic. And then once we're familiar with that, just switch over to a graph of delta G. Reaction progress. Start with reactants, we'll go down. And we'll contrast that with another diagram. Reaction progress. Delta G. And we'll start the same height on reactants, we'll end up higher. And again, let's see, where's our activation energy? Well, where you start to get to the hill, that's your activation energy, E activation. And where you start and where you end, this distance, is the change in what? Change in G. It's the Gibbs free energy change, and it's negative. Okay, if it was H and negative, it would be exothermic, but this is G, so it's the other term that has an X in front of it. It's exergonic. And it just says, okay, if it was exothermic, heat's leaving. This is exergonic, free energy is leaving, free energy is negative. It's better known as spontaneous. Okay, and then we can go the other way. Start low, big hill then. There's a large activation energy. And then where you end up is also higher. So it's a positive. Delta G is positive. It's an increase in energy. So if an increase in heat, endothermic, increase in G, endergonic. And it just means it's not spontaneous. It's non-spontaneous. And what do we say about non-spontaneous reactions? We said the reverse of them is a spontaneous reaction. Or in other words, if you start with the products and you go backwards, then you start high and you end low. The reverse reaction is now spontaneous. You started high on the product side, you end low on the reactants if you're going backwards. That is now spontaneous. Delta G is negative, and now if delta G is negative, you can use the term exergonic. It's an exergonic reaction. Cool. All righty. That's enough for now, I think. Let me double check my notes. No, that's not enough for now. So we got rate of reaction. It's proportional to the size of the hill. But let's tie in the three things about speeding up reactions. So how do we speed up a reaction? One, we heat it up. Increase the temperature. Two, add more reactants. Three, add a catalyst. Okay, this could be an endothermic, exothermic, exergonic reaction, doesn't matter. It's all about that size of the hill. Let's just do delta G, or reaction progress. And let's start high and low. I'm going to put a big old hill here. Okay, large hill, size of the hill is where you start to the top of the hill. That's your activation energy, very large, makes for a slow reaction. Or in other words, at room temperature, let's say, these molecules are bumping each other and they don't have enough energy to break those chemical bonds, doesn't have enough energy to get to the top of this hill. So you move them faster so that they can collide with more strength, more force. And if it still doesn't work, heat them even hotter, get them going faster, move. If it's a solid, they can vibrate in place. You heat them up, they vibrate even more. And then maybe as they vibrate, they can collide and heat up and burn, or do a chemical reaction if it's not combustion. There you go. So that's the idea. Heat up the reaction. Your energy diagram doesn't change. We just imagine with higher temperature, more of the molecules will have a chance for a very effective collision, head-on collision, to have enough energy to make it over the hill, move on the products. If you add more reactants, there's just more molecules, more opportunities for a good collision, right? So if you have a very dilute system, the molecules are bumping around and the solvent molecules are not finding each other. But if you dump in more reactants, more reactant molecules flying around, they're more concentrated, they're more likely to collide with each other. And the more often they collide, more chances they can collide head on and go on over that activation energy hill to make products. The energy diagram still doesn't change. If you add a catalyst, that's when the diagram changes. So we talked a little bit about how the catalyst can create reactive intermediates or just a new pathway to change reactants in the products. So the idea is that the initial energy and the final energy, those should be the same, but the pathway changes. So instead of going all the way up to here, Just kind of estimate, maybe that's my original hill. Maybe the new hill looks like this. Or it might look like this. And this little dip, this little valley, is where that indicates the creation of an intermediate, something that was a short-lived product, a portion of the molecule that kind of paused, it snapped off some bonds, and it kind of wandered around the solution, waiting for another reagent molecule to collide with it and continue on to products. But in both cases, the catalyst is going to lower the activation energy. Add a catalyst lowers the activation energy. It makes the hill smaller. And sometimes it changes the shape of the hill. Now there's two little hills. They're both a lot smaller than the original one. So it's easier for molecules to collide to get over these little hills. And they do it more often and the reaction goes faster. Okay, that's plenty for now. I'll see you in the next video.